Less than 24 hours, Georgians will be under a shelter-in-place order.
McDonald, though, said he did not know the man was handcuffed and was trying to use his foot to pin him to the ground so he could be handcuffed.
If your friends, neighbors, or local organizations are not complying, report them to us.
Howdy, everybody. Welcome to the Free Georgia Podcast. My name is Jake Green, and I'm joined by my co-host, brand new co-host, Cat Hartley. Cat, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing great. Excited to talk to our guest. Before we get to that, if y'all have any questions about the Libertarian Party or what we're doing to spread freedom and liberty across the state of Georgia, you can go to lpgeorgia.com. If you happen to not be in Georgia and you're listening to this, you can go to lp.org and find your state affiliate through that website. We have tons of resources on the website to help you navigate what we're doing and how to get involved and all sorts of stuff. My personal favorite is the Liberty Watch, which Brian Allen puts out, that basically tells you what legislation is being adopted each year in Georgia Congress. So, and what that legislation would mean for you. Kat, are you on that email chain?
Yes, I am.
Nice. Do you read it? Because it's extensive.
Yeah, since I've been doing the social media, I've actually kind of had to read it. So
Nice. Yeah. Tell folks your new position within LP Georgia.
yeah, so I'm the social media coordinator for the state. So I'm posting more on Facebook and Twitter for the party.
Heck
And I
yeah.
might be making an Instagram soon, so look out for that.
We have a couple defunct Instagram accounts, I think. So maybe we can reboot one of those.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would make it a little bit easier on you. When leadership changes hands, sometimes certain accounts get lost. So, but I think I still have one of our Instagram handles. So I think we'll get you set up there. So that'll be good. If y'all aren't following us on Twitter or Facebook, go do it at LP Georgia on Twitter or X, and then Libertarian Party of Georgia on Facebook. And Libertarian Party of Georgia on Facebook has a pretty substantial following, so you'd be able to interact with a bunch of libertarians on there. Although, as Kat points out, it's probably a bunch of bots too. So, y'all. Today we are doing our second episode in a row with You Are the Power. They have more news to give us. Today we're going to be talking to Ryan Ralston. So without further ado, let's go talk to him. All right, Mr. Ryan Ralston, welcome back to the Free Georgia Podcast, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well, brother. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. We had Jennifer Williams on last week, or 2 weeks ago now, and she shared a bunch of good news regarding the Hernandez case. Do you have any most recent updates from the past week and a half or so?
Yeah, so we were in court yesterday. We were back in juvenile court in Forsyth County with the Hernandez family, and they have been completely reunified with their babies. So the judge closed out the juvenile court case. Legal guardianship was transferred back over to Matt and Tucky. And as a matter of fact, as we walked out of the courtroom and kind of turned to the right to leave the courthouse, their youngest daughter, Emma, was in the hallway waiting on us. And so that was tremendous to see. And then Matt Tucky left the courthouse and went and picked up Aria from a day camp. And they went out to lunch, and the girls got to spend the night in their home for the first time in almost 800 days.
Good Lord. That's got to feel so good, but also a little, bittersweet from just 800 days not sleeping in your own house as a kid. That's miserable.
I will say this, because Matt and Tucky's case is really what kicked off our work within the family policing space nationally, to see them vindicated, right? After almost 2 year, just almost 800 days of them basically shouting the truth at everybody, saying, look, we did not hurt our baby. We did not hurt our baby. And then to have been vindicated last month in court when they were found not guilty, and then to go back into juvenile court and have the same judge that took them from their care, returned them to their care, was something that was really nice to see.
Wow. Yeah. And for those who don't know the full story of what we're talking about, I would encourage you to go back and watch our previous episode, because Jennifer Williams laid it all out and kind of described everything that had happened up to this point. So, we're not going to get as much into that today. But yeah, we kind of wanted to focus on more of the legislation, the legal side of things
Sure.
today. And
Sure.
Kat, do you have what's your first question for Ryan?
Excuse me. So, how do you balance activism with spreading awareness? So some of these cases are very emotional. So how do you keep it not too emotional, so people aren't, turned away from it whenever you're spreading that activism?
Sure. And the short answer, Kat, is very carefully. And you have to walk that fine line, because within the cases, specifically what we're going to call the Georgia 6, the original 6 families in Georgia that we supported through this type of work, through CPS type work. I live here in Georgia, so I know these families. Over the course of the past 2+ years, 3 years, you develop a bond, a kinship with these families. And so you have to, when you are advocating, there are times where just internally you have to check that, because you're ultimately trying to encourage legislators and policymakers to feel the same empathy that you feel for these families, right? You want to translate that in the most professional manner as possible. And when you're working with legislators who are unaware of the issues that these families are contending with, whether it's a CPS related case or any other cause that you or the power has taken on, they may not fully understand the depth of the issue that we're trying to address. And so there are times where it is difficult to check that emotion and to speak from maybe just an intellectual standpoint versus like from the heart. And so it presents a unique set of challenges for us, especially in our advocacy work. And one of the ways that we deal with that, Kat, is anytime we tell a story, whether it's on our social media, whether it's during a podcast, whether it's an interview with local media, we approach it from a truthful perspective. We understand that we have the truth on our side each and every time we're out there speaking. And it's because we have such a lengthy vetting process before we take on a cause. So we know 100% that any cause that we have taken on, that these families, these parents, these organizations have been victimized by the government, and they are in fact factually innocent. And so we know we have the truth on our side anytime we have a conversation with a policymaker or a legislator. And so it really boils down to good old fashioned communication, right? So we establish a rapport with anyone that we're talking to. And we do so in a respectful manner. We don't come to a legislator. We don't come to a policymaker with pitchforks and torches just demanding change. Like we sit down and have heartfelt conversations with these individuals, and we approach it from a respectful standpoint. And that opens the door for further dialogue. And as an end result, specifically here in Georgia, we partnered up with families that ultimately led to the passage of Ridge's Law, which is SB 259, which is second opinion legislation, something that's sorely needed here in Georgia, specifically as it relates to parents with medically fragile children.
Interesting. I imagine that most of these legislators and policymakers are bombarded with things all the time. And kind of I don't know, people requesting things or asking them to do things kind of just becomes white noise at some point. At least that's how I would feel. Walking that line, that's got to be tough line to walk at times, because it is an emotionally charged subject. How often are they just completely not receptive and versus actually willing to sit down and chat with you?
Sure. Initially, Jake, they are cautious. Let's just say that they're cautious, right? Because we have a reputation. You're the Power has a reputation of bringing about effectual reform, right? So there is a certain level of respect that we get when we send an email, when we go knock on the legislator's door or policymaker's door. But there's also that little bit of skepticism too, because they want to know more about who we are as an organization and at times who we are as individuals when we send that email. So that's that rapport that's initially established. But once we get through the basic introductions, and once they get a better understanding, once a lawmaker or policymaker gets a better understanding of who we are as an organization and who we are as individuals, that commonality, that common ground opens the door for follow-up conversations. And so again, the way that we approach this is from a point of we want to establish mutual respect. Again, we don't view a policymaker or a lawmaker as an adversary. There's somebody that we see that humanality in, we see that common ground in, and we want to work with. And there are times where certain lawmakers or policymakers, they don't want to talk to us. And that's where persistence becomes our friend, right? So just because one policymaker or lawmaker says, hey, Ryan or whomever, well, I'm not so sure we want to continue this conversation, it doesn't mean that we're going to stop trying to reach out to them. Because we feel or we know that the truth is on our side, and we also feel and know that these conversations need to be had, even if they're uncomfortable for that policymaker or that legislator.
Yeah, 100%. Kat, you got another question?
Yeah, now that the Ridges law is passed, do y'all have any other legislation that y'all are trying to push? Because I know from talking to Jennifer that there's a lot of financial incentives that bring the issues into, those cases. So are y'all looking at, bringing about disincentivizing those DFACS government agencies or any other types of legislation?
Sure. Yeah. Do not be surprised during next session in Georgia if we start pushing legislation that would end immunity for these doctors. And so one of the things that we have been able to determine just through 2 years of just nonstop work on these types of cases is that there is financial incentive to take children, to keep them in foster care, and to have them adopted out, right? There is financial incentive. And one of the things that we were able to determine specifically is, let me back up. As it relates to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, some of these child abuse pediatricians who are misdiagnosing medically fragile children with abuse, we were able to determine that they're paid through grants. And so I'll equate it to this, right? So if you and Jake were doctors at a hospital and you were going to come to me for a grant and you say, Ryan, we need $5 million annually because what we're going to do is we're going to help children. We're going to diagnose abuse. And I say, okay, that sounds like a really good idea. Here's $5 million. Well, if you don't diagnose abuse throughout that year and you don't help children, when you come back to me the next year and say, hey, I need another $5 million, I'm probably not going to be inclined to cut another check. And so we have found that there is financial incentive for these doctors to diagnose abuse. And then there are all these federal funds that come in through Title IV, Title IV-E specifically, to keep children in foster care. And so we really think that if we, as an organization, continue to raise awareness about this financial incentive and show that money is the root of all evil during this situation or these situations, if we could take away some of that funding, I think you're going to find that the medical malpractice or the misdiagnosis of abuse is going to significantly drop. And then the state's not going to want to keep children in foster care for any longer than what they have to. And so do not be surprised during the next legislative session if we start working on a bill that would take away those bad governmental actors' immunity.
And do you have any like suggestions on how to improve that system?
Sure. Besides taking away the financial incentive or reducing the financial incentive, I think it boils down to proper training and education for those DFACS workers, for child abuse pediatricians, for law enforcement officers, and for investigators within DFACS, and also their case managers. What it boils down to is a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding, and a lack of proper training. And what I mean by that is, from the child abuse pediatrician, from the time mom or dad walks into the hospital with their baby and says, I need some help, the child abuse pediatrician is essentially a hammer looking for a nail. So they're going to start running a litany of tests or a battery of tests on these babies, and they're going to find one thing they can hang their hat on and say, well, this is likely abuse. And from that point, it triggers child abuse protocol, which would involve DFACS and involve local law enforcement. One thing that I have seen and can say with 100% certainty is that DFACS and local law enforcement are ill-equipped to investigate these types of cases. And here's why. No crime occurred. They're medical malpractice cases. This is a misdiagnosis of abuse. And so if DFACS is not doing their due diligence, and if law enforcement is not doing their due diligence, or they approach these cases with a bias, right? Because they say, well, a child abuse pediatrician is a doctor, they're an expert. So if they're saying it's abuse, then it has to be abuse. When the reality is the child abuse pediatrician cannot say within a medical degree of certainty that abuse occurred. They can only say it's within a mathematical probability. So if you want to look at just from a mathematical standpoint, if they're saying they're 75% sure, or mathematically they're saying it's 75% likely that abuse occurred, but law enforcement and DFACS and that child abuse pediatrician is ignoring that other 25%, that's where these cases lie. And that's where these mistakes are made. I saw it personally with the Timms trial up in Gordon County, where DFACS workers and law enforcement acknowledged that on the stand. They said, we didn't do independent investigation. We didn't do our due diligence. We simply relied on the opinion of a doctor that abuse occurred. And so as a result, Brady and Carrie were ultimately acquitted. But during the roughly 1,400 days that they were out their son, no one involved in this process at all stepped up and said, hey, a mistake could have been made. They just basically doubled down and wanted to pursue this all the way to fruition at criminal trial. So that's part of the issue that we've uncovered, and that's part of the issue that needs to be addressed.
How often does that occur where DFACS tries to pursue it when they, aren't actually sure that it happened?
So in the cases that we have been directly involved with or indirectly involved with, we would say it's 100% of the time. And that's what I mean by training and education is critical, because these individuals who work for DFACS, who work in law enforcement, they're just ill-equipped to handle these cases. There's not proper training, there's not proper knowledge, there's not proper experience available for these cases, and so they simply rely on these opinions of these doctors that abuse has occurred without doing any independent investigation on their own. And Kat, one of the things that becomes critical, and I wanted to stress this, when you get involved in any type of investigation, and it doesn't matter what the subject matter is, the investigator must allow fact and not theory to drive the work that they do. And in this case, law enforcement and DFACS, they invent their own facts, or they really use theory and they call them facts to continue their investigations. Now, what we have seen as a result of the work that we've done here in Georgia and honestly across the country is Child Protective Services are now stopping and reevaluating their work. Now, it doesn't mean that they're getting proper training. It just means that there's such a public awareness that has been raised on these cases that they're second guessing their decisions. And that's exactly what we want.
Some people would say that them doubling down or like saying there's abuse when, there's not much evidence would keep children that are actually abused more often, like save more children that are abused. Do you think that actually happens, or do you think there's still a lot of children out there that are being abused that are not being helped by DFACS?
I think, Kat, that just based on the sheer numbers that I've seen for DFACs in Georgia or just across the country with Child Protective Services, they close out Child Protective Services and DFACs here in Georgia. They close out more cases than they help. So they basically, if DFACs receives a report of abuse and they go knock on the door at a house and no one comes to the door, they close that case out. They don't pursue anything else after that. So there are probably more instances of abuse that are reported and that are not properly investigated than there are misdiagnosis of abuse where no abuse actually occurred, and then they pursue to try to take these children from factually innocent parents. So their priorities are a bit out of whack here. And so until that is also addressed, Kat, I think you're going to continue to see more children, at least in Georgia, harmed by the lack of proper investigative measures on behalf of DFACs.
Are there any statistics on people who bring in their children who have clearly been injured in some way, medically fragile children or whatever? Are there any statistics on people who actually do abuse their kids, bringing them into a hospital to seek treatment versus these families who bring in their kids who they don't know what's wrong with their kids?
Sure.
Yeah.
Specifically from the testimony of a child abuse pediatrician who works at CHOA during the Timms trial, CHOA typically sees close to 2,000 children a year for allegations of abuse, and roughly 30 to 33% of those cases are substantiated. So what you're seeing is parents bringing their children into the hospital or a mandated reporter saying, I believe abuse has occurred. And so CHOA is only able to substantiate about 30% of those cases. Additionally, based on the numbers that DFACs puts out there on their own here in Georgia, the fact that they're closing out more cases than they're accepting. And what I mean by closing out cases, it might be upwards of 60,000 cases per year are being closed out, but they're only substantiating about maybe 10 to 12,000 of those cases, right? So it's a significant difference in numbers of the work that they're actually doing. And it's also very subjective, right? When you're talking about neglect, if you say, well, a mandated reporter says, well, a child is being neglected by their mom. What exactly by law does neglect mean? It's open for interpretation. And so what we have seen as well is a lot of neglect cases are being opened up simply because a mom or dad lives at or below the poverty level. And so that triggers a DFACs investigation, but it's not against the law to be poor. And it's not against the law to live at or below the poverty level, but yet, people are sending, mandated reporters are sending Child Protective Services workers out to homes because a child might come to school with a dirty shirt on, or might wear the same set of clothes 2 or 3 times during the week. And so it's those type of cases that DFAC spends, or Child Protective Services spends, a lot of time on, when they should be focusing in their attention on the children who are actually being abused. Yeah.
I gotta say, I wear probably the same clothes for 5 days in a row each week. So that should not be something that is looked at.
No. I mean, I equate it to my childhood, where my brother and I, and then my sister, when I'm about 10 years older than my sister. So when she came along, we lived outside. We would get out of school, go play all summer long. We were just dirty, feral little children that lived in rural Georgia. And I could only imagine if Child Protective Services came knocking on my mom and dad's door saying, hey, Ryan and Josh and Rachel are wearing dirty clothes. The times have changed, but unfortunately that's where we are as a society, because when I talk about mandated reporters, just about every profession that would have contact with a child on a daily basis has been mandated by the state as a reporter, and they receive very little training, right? So when they say, oh, well, this child has been neglected, or I suspect abuse, The mandated reporter doesn't have to prove neglect or prove abuse. They just have to say, I suspect that abuse or neglect occurred, and that triggers an investigation.
Are these like mandated reporters? Are these like teachers and like general practitioners and stuff like that?
So they're teachers, they're counselors, they're doctors, there's nurses, there's law enforcement. So anybody that would have direct contact with a child has been basically deputized by the state to report allegations of suspected abuse or neglect. And again, it's very open to interpretation what neglect is. Now, if there's a case of abuse, right, it's typically glaring, right? It's you know, if a 4 or 5 year old comes to preschool with a black eye or something like that, that is going to be, that's where a mandated reporter should make somebody aware. But again, we're seeing more and more cases where people who live at or below the poverty level are being turned into child protective services for neglect.
Wow. Yeah. And then if they are at or below the poverty line, that makes it a lot harder for them to fight for their children in the legal system, because it's extremely expensive to do so.
It is. It's very expensive to do so. And not only that, but parents don't understand their rights either. Right. So when Child Protective Services comes knocking on your door, you don't have to let them in. But parents who have done nothing wrong, right? Parents who are factually innocent are going to say, well, come on in, take a look around. Like, I've done no wrong, my house, But what you see a lot of the times is the people who are showing up and knocking on your door are upper middle class individuals, and they're going and knocking on the door of someone who lives at or below the poverty line. And so their standard of living biases their opinion about what neglect could be.
Yeah. Do y'all ever do any work with Parents USA?
Yes. David DeLugas and his organization are fantastic. We have worked with, but we shared David's work on the Brittany Patterson case in North Georgia. Nice. And we're going to share David's work again with the family, the mother and her boyfriend in Calhoun, who were arrested because they left to go visit a storage facility or something like that, and left an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old alone for a couple hours. So yeah, we're going to get involved in that as well.
Yep, we're interviewing David very soon about that specific case. So
yeah, he does great work. I'm proud to call him my friend and to work with him and to be able to partner on cases like this.
Nice. Kat, you got any more questions?
I was gonna ask, because there's another bill that got passed about parents and neglect, and like defining that in the like what is neglect, and if a parent doesn't think that it is, that like they're not what's the word? Like they're bringing common sense, at least it's what the bill says, into charging parents with neglect now.
Yeah. I think if memory serves me correctly, that is a bill based off of David's work and based off the Brittany Patterson case here in Georgia. So again, with Brittany's case, she let her son walk into town like maybe a mile down the road, and someone called the police and said, your child was in danger or whatnot. And lo and behold, Brittany was arrested. So I believe that bill directly was either the result of the Brittany Patterson case or indirectly as a result, because so many lawmakers were made aware about Brittany's case and said, we need some common sense here. It needs to be put on the record, because arresting a mom who let their child walk a half mile down the street to a store in a town that had less than 1,000 people or something like that, and one stoplight, that's ridiculous. And so it does, I think, again, if memory serves me correctly, that's based on David's work and Parents USA's work on the Brittany Patterson case.
Yeah, how much does like a story, because the Brittany Patterson case got national attention. Yeah. Like how often, like how much does that help or hurt your work with You Are the Power? It
definitely helps. And the reason why I say that is the more the general public understands the dangers of governmental overreach, right? What we call the family policing system. Anytime the government gets involved in how a parent chooses to raise their child is a dangerous precedent that's being set. And I want the government as far away from children as possible. And in order to do that, we need to just raise the public awareness about what's going on. Georgia right now seems to be a hotbed for government overreach, and it really is. But the more that we work within the family policing space, we understand that it is really a national issue. And I do believe that it starts with these mandated reporters, and I believe it starts with their lack of knowledge and their lack of training about what abuse or neglect actually is. Yeah. And so it just opens the door to more government overreach, and it literally opens the door, or the potential to have the government knock on your door and question a parent or a guardian about how they choose to raise their child.
Yeah. Government overreach, like, most of us know that, like, California has, there are certain states that have massive overreach, but you don't really think about it, and it's not like a glaring thing. But I think in Georgia, most people think of Georgia as, like, a free Southern state, very like open. And so I think some of the laws that are being enforced, or the ways that these things are being enforced, make it a far more glaring issue, and a really good place to like focus on, in one of these, and a state that's more known for being more freedom oriented.
Yeah, it is. And I've seen this just through our work, Jake, too, is within the family policing system, it seems to be more prevalent. The abuse seems to be more prevalent in the Southeast. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't occur across the country, because it absolutely does, but it seems to be more prevalent in the Southeast right now. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that, I'll give you Georgia, for example. Georgia was founded as a penal colony. I mean, if you go back and look at the history, that's exactly what it was founded as. And law enforcement in the Southeast was founded not to protect an individual's rights or anything like that. Law enforcement in the South was founded, and its primary purpose was to track down property, and by property I mean slaves. Yep. And so law enforcement in the Southeast was really founded to track a human being's property, which would have been a slave. Whereas if you compare it to law enforcement in the Northeast or across the country, law enforcement there was founded to protect an individual's home, or to protect them from really government overreach. But so law enforcement's role in the South was different. And so the laws that we have on the books now, specifically in the South, specifically in Georgia, does nothing more than reinforce the mentality that the lawmakers in the Southeast had hundreds of years ago, right? They want to keep people enslaved to the government. And so it's that mentality that we're fighting against, and it's that mentality that we're working to correct. And so it starts with these mandated reporters knocking on your door saying, hey, so-and-so told me you're not doing right by your child, so let me come in there and see what's going on. And so that law enforcement mentality needs to change.
Would defining abuse legally, like very specifically, do you think that would help, or do you think that would, cause lawyers or people to kind of like search for it more? Like, I don't know what the word is. Like, do you think that would help defining it very specifically in our law?
Sure. Well, let me back up too. I think proper training for mandated reporters is needed, and here's why. Because the mandated reporters are going to allege abuse, but abuse in a mandated reporter's mind rises to the level of a crime. But then when you're talking about a crime, and the elements of a crime have to be met in order to pursue proper prosecution, right? So if the law enforcement official reads a report from a mandated reporter, and the mandated reporter thinks that abuse occurred, is dependent. The law enforcement officer must properly investigate that, right? Because what they're working for is, if a crime occurred, they're ultimately working towards proof beyond reasonable doubt. They want a conviction at trial. But what you're seeing a lot of these law enforcement officers do specifically in Georgia, is they work a case to probable cause only, right? Probable cause is going to equal the arrest. They don't concern themselves with what happens at trial. They don't concern themselves with that proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's where you're seeing more and more factually innocent parents or factually innocent individuals being arrested based on allegations of abuse, because law enforcement's not doing their proper investigation and getting all the evidence. Because one of the things that law enforcement should be doing is, if there's an allegation of abuse, you have to also try to disprove that. And the way that you disprove that is by gathering all the evidence, gathering the documentation, conducting interviews, and then sitting down with some of these mandated reporters and sitting down with some of these doctors or other professionals and saying, why do you think abuse occurred? So it really is, it comes down to training, and it comes down to that communication, it comes down to that proper investigation. But there are already laws on the books that define within elements of a crime what the crime actually is. So I'll give you an example. A lot of the cases that we work in Georgia, or have sponsored in Georgia, dealt with first-degree child cruelty or aggravated battery. So we had babies with broken bones. But the mandated reporter could not say what the mechanism was for that broken bone. The only thing that they could say was, we saw a baby with fractures in various stages of healing. Well, a law enforcement officer takes a look at that and they say, oh, there's a baby that's got a broken bone. Aggravated battery had to have occurred. But you can't say what that mechanism was. So mom and dad says, no, look, the baby is medically fragile, has vitamin D deficiency, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, OI, whatever the case may be. So law enforcement ignores that. And they say, well, all I see is a broken bone, has to be aggravated battery. But the elements of that crime have not been met, right? Where's the intent? Where's mom and dad's intent to harm their baby? Where's that mechanism? That's where it comes in with these child abuse pediatricians, where they just, I'll be honest with you, they just start making stuff up. They say, well, mom or dad must have squeezed the baby, or they must have drop kicked the baby, or they must have punched the baby. But there's no evidence of that. There's no physical evidence that occurred, right? So where's the intent? And so I think that boils back down to training, but there's a disconnect between the mandated reporter and the law enforcement official, because those two typically aren't speaking, or they're not speaking the same language. And what I mean by not speaking the same language is, a mandated reporter says abuse, and law enforcement says, okay, well, if it is abuse, what kind of abuse is it? And they say, well, there's a broken bone. Well, law enforcement doesn't do their due diligence to try to investigate how that broken bone occurred. They just say, well, I see a broken bone. That's aggravated battery. I'm going to go swear out a warrant for aggravated battery. And that ends their investigation. That's it. So they've worked to probable cause, but they have not worked to proof beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. And that's where you see factually innocent families like Brady and Carey get acquitted, or Matt Tucky Hernandez get acquitted, because no crime ever occurred and no one's doing their job. So defining what abuse or neglect is does help, but there's already laws on the book that says this is what actual abuse is, but there's that disconnect between the mandated reporter and the law enforcement official.
Gotcha. Well, Kat, we have time for one more question. You got one more question for Ryan?
Do you have anything positive to say about defects?
Yeah, actually, I do. And I don't want to say that, I don't want to come across as me bashing defects. The harsh reality is they're a needed organization. And what I mean by that is, there are actually parents out there who abuse their babies. There's moms and dads out there who need assistance paying for groceries, who need counseling. I mean, there is a need for an organization like Defects and Child Protective Services. However, when they get it wrong, they get it really wrong, and they fracture factually innocent families. And so I think that's where education and training is so critical and so important for a caseworker, for a defects investigator, for a case manager, for a regional director, to take a look at these families on an individual basis, to go into their homes and conduct interviews and talk to neighbors and talk to the doctors who are involved in these cases, to talk to the teachers for these children, to really gain a better understanding or better insight into what these families are going through. And the reason why I say that, Kat, is this. The number one indicator that would substantiate an allegation of abuse in a home is whether or not there is a step parent in the home, right? And in all the cases that we have supported, there has never been a step parent in the home. So they are not approaching these cases in the appropriate way. And I don't want to say that I'm up here bad mouthing DFACS and Child Protective Services, because I'm not. I just want them to do their due diligence, right? I want them to ensure that when they file a report or they level allegations of abuse, before they petition a juvenile court judge to terminate parental rights or to take a baby out of the home, I want to make sure they have all their ducks in a row. And again, I think they are not doing that. I believe they are not doing their due diligence. And the easiest way to correct that is through proper training and education.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Appreciate the work y'all are doing. LP Georgia's a huge fan of Spike Cohen and You Are the Power. So, how can people support y'all? What can people do to help? Yeah,
reach out to us at youarethepower.net. As a volunteer director for the organization, what I love to tell people to do is, if you click on the Join Us button at the top, there's a free membership option. What I like to say is, take us for a test drive. Let us know what you think about us. Get plugged into our causes, receive our monthly newsletters, attend some of our training. And then the biggest thing that people can do to get plugged in and help us is, when we have a cause, share it on your social media, send emails on behalf of the causes to the government officials that we're trying to identify, and basically say, hey, you need to stop doing what you're doing. Like, send those emails, share the stuff on social media. If you join, whether you join on the free membership or the paid membership, you're going to get an email from me. You're going to get my personal cell phone number. If you have any questions, give me a call. Like, I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have. If you want to have a Zoom meeting, we'll set up a Zoom meeting. Want to correspond via email, we'll correspond via email. But I just always say, join that free membership, take us for a test drive, and let us know what you think. And then we'll have a further discussion about a paid membership. But I love to communicate with people. That's why on every email that I sent out, they get my personal cell phone number. And so I would appreciate that conversation with anybody who has any questions about the organization.
Awesome. Ryan, thanks so much, man. Appreciate you coming on.
Oh, you bet. Thank you guys for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Heck yeah. And for everybody else out there, thank you for tuning into the Free Georgia podcast. We'll be back next week. So we'll catch you then. Peace.